Hello everyone, my name is Morris Sekio Sullivan. I'm a Zen master and a Vietnamese lineage of Rinzai Zen. I'm a Buddhist minister with Bright Dawn Center for Oneness Buddhism. I'm the spiritual head of Volusia Buddhist Fellowship in DeLand, Florida, and I officiate a lot of the English-speaking programs at White Sands Buddhist Center in Mims, Florida, and also co-lead a group of Buddhist inmates at Tomoka Correctional Institution. So as you can imagine, I give quite a few Dharma talks. I spend a lot of time talking about Buddhism, but it occurred to me that not everyone can come to land or Mims, and fortunately not too many of you are in prison. So I thought I would share some of this on YouTube, and hopefully you'll like it, and it will help you deepen your spiritual life, whatever that means to you, and certainly would be interested in knowing what you'd like to hear about. So let me know, and I look forward to hearing from you. But I want to talk a little bit today about a couple of things that have come up in some of these meetings. I talked about this at the White Sands Buddhist Center last week and then talked about it again at Tomoka Correctional Institution. A couple of ideas that a lot of Americans have a little difficulty coming to terms with when they first approach Buddhism, and that's the idea of faith and merit. We don't think of faith a lot in Buddhism because Buddhism isn't a matter of believing in God. It's a matter of putting certain ideas into practice. But faith is important to Buddhist practice nevertheless. There's a very complicated teaching that if you start reading about Buddhism, you're going to come across eventually, and it's the 12 factors of dependent origination. And this is really an explanation of how ignorance conditions mental processes, which condition consciousness, which condition a whole lot of other stuff, finally leading up to dukkha, to stress and suffering. And there's another teaching that sort of goes along with it, but that you don't encounter quite as often. This explains that dukkha conditions faith. So when you're experiencing dukkha, then at some point you can realize that, and recognizing that you're in a position of stress and a place of suffering, then you can realize that there's a way to go beyond that. And so you really need dukkha to go on to start on a spiritual path. I tell people this all the time. I don't think anybody ever thinks, oh, gee, things are going really well for me. It's such a great day. I think I'll start going to church, or I'll start looking into Buddhism and see if that, nobody does that. They all go, oh, I'm stressed, I'm suffering. They've gone through a tragedy or something like that. And then they start looking for the spiritual life. And that's fine. That's what the Buddha did. You probably know about the story of the Buddha. You realize that despite his wealth and despite his power and his privilege and luxurious life, that he was still subject to the pain of rebirth. He was still subject to the pain of old age. He was subject to the suffering of being ill. He was eventually going to die. And not only that, but all of his loved ones were going to experience all those things as well. And so he started looking for a way to transcend that. He wanted to get out of the cycle of stress. And it's the same thing that we do when we realize that our lives the way we're living our lives are creating a lot of stress for us, a lot of suffering in various forms. Then we start looking for a way to transcend that stress. And it's the same cycle of suffering, whether you're talking about stress on your job or stress in your relationship or whatever. Or whether you're talking about nirvana. So there's a great story that comes out of the Thai tradition. I heard this when I was a Thai monk briefly, and the abbot of the temple down in Kissimmee tells this story sometimes. Now, these two monks who were great friends. They spent most of their life in the same monastery and very close friends, and so they promised each other that after they died, in the next life, they would come find one another. And so one day, one of these monks, after they had died, one of these fellows had been reborn a deva, a heavenly being in one of the heaven realms. And so one day he was thinking about this, and these Devas can remember their past lives. So he's kind of casting back over his past life, and he remembers his buddy. He says, I wonder whatever happened to that guy. And so he starts sending his mind around the heavens to look for his friend, which Devas can do that too. They can just kind of send their mind out to go check things out. And he didn't find him anywhere in any of the heavens. So I thought, well, that's odd. So he sent his mind down into the human realms to look around. Looked all through the human realms for him too. Couldn't find him anywhere. So then he starts looking through the animals and the insects, and he finally finds his pal as a worm in a pile of dung. So he says, well, that's not going to do. He should be better than that. I'm going to go down and get him and bring him up to heaven where everything is nice and where you get to live for a long time and enjoy all these benefits of being a heavenly being. And so he goes down to the cow pasture or wherever where his buddy was living in this pile of dung, and he calls to him. This worm pokes his head out of the pile of dung and says, yes, who are you? He says, well, I'm your friend from a past life. And, worms can't remember their past life, so he had to be reminded of this stuff. He says, I'm your friend from a past life, and I live in the heavens now, and I'd like to take you up there with me. And so this worm said, well, why would you want to do that? I'm perfectly happy here in my pile of dung. And he says, oh, but it's so much better up in the heavens. All these great, you get all these great benefits and everything. You get to live for a long time. Everything's very nice. And the worm goes, no, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. So this Deva thinks, well, if I could just get him out of this pile of dung and take him up there with me, he'll realize how wonderful everything is, And so he starts digging around in this dung pile, trying to pull the worm out of it. And the harder he pulls, the harder the worm clings to this pile of dung. Well, we're a lot like this a lot of the time. We're clinging to something that's really not worth holding on to. And there's something better. And so a lot of the time we don't realize there's something better. So we're holding fast to these things that really are stressful over the long run. You think about it. Have you ever thought, wow, pizza is really bad for you? It's got a lot of sodium in it. It's got a lot of fats, a lot of processed carbohydrates, and saturated fat and all that kind of stuff. If I eat pizza, it'll probably kill me. I think I'll order one. No, of course you don't. You think, oh, I'm hungry and pizza's good, so you order pizza, right? And it's the same thing with relationships. You've probably never looked at another person, a female or whatever, and said, oh, that girl, boy, if I got together with her, she would just break my heart. Something awful probably when we break up. It'll really hurt. I think I'll ask her out. Of course not. You think, oh, I'm lonely. I want a relationship. And so you ask out this person who seems attractive to you and so on. So it doesn't mean, don't order a pizza ever. It doesn't mean don't fall in love, because those things are fine. It just means be realistic about what you're going to get out of them. And don't cling to things that are ultimately going to be disappointing, or ultimately going to let you down if that's where you base your happiness upon. So dukkha then, when we realize that we're living in a stressful situation, then we can start looking around and say, okay, is there something more, is there a better refuge? Is there a higher refuge? Is there something that lasts beyond this particular condition, which is going to come to an end, that's going to let me down eventually? And this is what happened to the Buddha when he realized that he was born into this cycle of stress and suffering. He saw a holy man come walking through the garden outside the palace. And this was someone who seemed to have transcended all of this stuff. And so he said, well, I'm going to go into homelessness and see if I can do that too. And so he set out and spent 6 years practicing and trying to find a way out of this cycle of stress. And so that's where Buddhism came from. So you first need this glimmer of faith. You need to see something and go, okay, I think there's a better way than I've been living. And then faith in Buddhism is not the end of everything. In a lot of religions you go, oh, what's the religion about? Well, I believe this. In Buddhism, though, you believe that there's something better, and so you go and see. And so you might say, okay, well, this Buddhist guy, he's making a lot of sense. I'm going to go listen to him talk. I'm going to go to services. And so you start listening to the Dharma, listening to the teachings. It doesn't do you a lot of good to hear somebody recite the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path if you don't understand what that means to you. So you have to look into this and penetrate the meaning. And that doesn't mean just understand it intellectually. It means understand what it means to you. How does this affect the way I live my life? How is knowing that compounded things change and are not self and are ultimately stressful, how is that going to change the way I live? And so you penetrate the meaning by asking yourself that. And then you put that into practice. Buddhism isn't about just what you believe. It's about what you practice. If you ask a Buddhist, Dharma teacher, what is this religion? It's do good, avoid evil, train your mind. It's not believe this and don't believe that. It's do these things. And that will lead to lead you out of stress, out of suffering. And then once you've started to do the practice, then you'll begin to realize the fruit of the practice. So a simple thing is in meditation. A lot of people come to Buddhism because they want to learn about meditation. And, I could talk to them about meditation till I'm blue in the face, but it's not going to do them any good to listen to me talk about it. It's not going to do any good even to understand how meditation works. But if you start putting it into practice, then you start realizing the fruits. And the fruits start with things like being able to concentrate better, being able to relax a little bit more, and things like that. People report that kind of stuff almost immediately as soon as they start practicing meditation with any regularity. So faith then, once you start putting this into practice, then faith becomes conditions for other things. Faith becomes conditions for joy. You'll start realizing that, hey, if I'm not stressing myself out all the time, I get to appreciate life a lot more. And that continues on until finally you get up to the point where faith is the starting point for something that's eventually going to lead you out of stress altogether, lead you to transcend stress, and that's awakening. So when you really start to appreciate the importance of something like practicing loving kindness, for instance, just practicing compassion, then and letting go of animosity and things like that, you get so much more peace, and that will lead you to have even more faith and want to practice more. So faith is something that continues to grow in Buddhist practice. So once you've decided, okay, I'm going to try this. I've heard about Buddhism now. I'm going to do something with it. I think, here's this guy who lived 2,600 years ago, and he was a human being just like me. He did some stuff I can do. I know what some of those things are. And he realized something that if I do what he said to do, I should be able to realize. Then what's your next step? And what an awful lot of Americans do is run out and buy books about Buddhism and start reading. And that's fine. You want to know what the Dharma is. You want to understand these things. That's that first part, hearing the Dharma. But there's a really kind of a quicker, simpler way to get going. And that's to understand the concept of making merit. A lot of Americans really don't like this idea. I'll start talking about making merit and people's eyes glaze over. But it's not that scary. The idea is that the law of karma. If you do good, you get a good result. If you do bad, you get a bad result. The good result, we consider, that's merit. Okay? You do a meritorious thing and you accumulate merit. It's the seed of good that's planted when you do a virtuous thing. So what's a virtuous thing? Do good, avoid evil, purify your mind. And by purify, I mean let go of the mental processes that keep bringing you back to stress. And you'll notice those when you start to practice. You'll realize what those things are, and you can start letting go of those things. And also cultivate those mental practices that lead you away from stress, things like loving kindness, which I mentioned before. You start to recognize that to want happiness for others is a real good source of happiness for yourself. To be compassionate for others is a good source of compassion for yourself, and so you get the benefits from that. Okay? So do good, avoid evil, train the mind. So what does it mean to do good? Well, you can write checks to charities. That's one way to do it. You can make offerings to your spiritual community or your temple or whatever, your church. Those are good because you're supporting something that's going to help others. Practicing generosity, basically. But you don't have to just be generous with money. If you don't have money, that's okay. You can still be generous. You can be generous with your time. You can be generous with your attention. You can be generous with your friendliness. Somebody can be having a really bad day and bring that to you in the form of rudeness or something. And instead of being rude back, you can give them the gift of a smile or kindness. Right? So a lot of the time we get stuck in this sort of philosophy of Buddhism and thinking about the Dharma and all of that kind of stuff. But really, the simplest way to do this is to start doing good and then avoid doing evil. What does that mean? When you become a Buddhist, you basically take 5 precepts. Not to kill, not to steal, not to engage in harmful sexual practices. Nobody really defines what those are, but you know whether you're doing something harmful or not. Not to engage in harmful speech, so no idle chatter, gossiping, angry speech, that kind of thing, harsh speech. And then not to use intoxicants till they cloud your mind. In other words, don't get so drunk that you forget that you weren't going to do those first 4 things. And then finally, train your mind. Learn how to meditate. Okay, that's a good thing to do. You don't have to meditate to be a Buddhist, but it helps. When you will notice when you decide that you're not going to do things like engage in idle, harmful gossip. You'll go to work and everybody's going to be gossiping about somebody. And you'll have to look at what's coming up in your mind and react to that in a way that's a little bit different. And that's training your mind too. So there's nobody counting merit points out there. And this is the problem a lot of Americans have. When you start talking about merit, they think, that sounds like some supernatural thing. I'm going to do good, and so there's this storehouse of merit out there, and I'm going to get to go to heaven when I die or whatever. It's not like that. It's really simple cause and effect. If you jump off a bridge, you're going to hit the water below, right? If you do good, you're going to get a good result. We don't know what the good result is necessarily, but we know we're going to have a good result. It's the same thing if you decided to start a physical workout program. If you went to the doctor and the doctor said, you've eaten too much pizza, you've got high blood pressure and you've got heart disease and you're overweight and you got to do something about that, right? So you could start on a workout program. You could get some cardio stuff. You could work out with weights a little bit. You could start eating better. All those are doing good. You're doing good for your body by exercising. You're restraining your body, avoiding evil by not taking in stuff that's bad for you. And you're going to get a good result from that. And you don't know exactly what it's going to be, but you're probably going to lose weight. You're probably going to get stronger. You're probably going to live longer, but you don't know exactly what form it's going to take. And it's the same with merit from a spiritual program. Do good, avoid evil, train your mind, you'll get a positive result. So that's merit in a nutshell. That's faith in a nutshell. I hope this has been interesting to you, and I look forward to getting your feedback, hearing if there's anything else that you'd like for me to talk to you about. If you'd like, you can put your hands together in front of your chest. This is a gasho. It's basically signifying oneness. We do practice Buddhism for the benefit of all beings, not just ourselves. And so this is the recognition that my happiness and my freedom is very much related to your happiness and your freedom to the extent that they're one and the same. So gasho, and have a good day.